Well, good morning again. Welcome to our study of the book of Daniel. We're on to chapter 6, which is the last chapter that we're going to take. I believe, start up a new Bible study after Christmas. We're going through the first half of Daniel, which is the historical part, and leaving the prophetic last half of the book for another time. We're going to continue with that theme that we've been following, living and thriving in a new normal. Sometimes a new normal is dealing with opposition to our faith. And today we're going to see that in Daniel's life, and also note how it is that God has us remain faithful even when we're being opposed in our faith or in the way that we live it. So I'll start out with a rather serious question. I think sometimes you've been asked that, though. It kind of goes back to that Columbine incident. If you remember, I think it was one of the first school shootings in Colorado. I believe it's a true story that the one young lady who was facing one of the gunmen was asked by them, "Are you a Christian?" And she confessed that and was shot on the spot. A pretty horrific thing when you think about it, especially after, the fact that you're a Christian. Like something like that should happen to you because of your faith. The question, though, sometimes is asked, if a gun was pointed at you and the gunman asked, "Are you a Christian?" What would you say? We'd like to say, I think, that we would confess our faith. You think of some of those passages that whoever acknowledges me before men, I will acknowledge before my Father in heaven, but whoever does not acknowledge me, I will not acknowledge them. So the fact that we be ready to stand up for Christ. In fact, what he even said, whoever loses his life for me, not necessarily your actual physical life, but it could come to that. Whoever loses their life for me will gain the life, will have the life that I have to give. So it is important to be ready to confess, to be standing up for Jesus as your Savior, even if it would mean a threat to your life, or maybe more often in some of the ways that we're opposed. In fact, that's what's really going to come up with Daniel, I think, the application to our lives. I'm not sure if we're always going to face a life-threatening situation as being a Christian, but the question can be applied to our lives. Can we still be confessors of Christ and not do damage to our faith when we are less open about our faith and our faithfulness to Him? So can we be more discreet about the fact that we're a Christian? Can we, maybe stay in the shadows, especially if people are out there to target us? They're looking for a Christian in order to take their hostility out on. And I think those are some of the issues that come up with Daniel chapter 6. In fact, maybe applying that more. In point number 3, in which of the following ways are you more likely to be opposed as a Christian? So think about your personal situation. Are any of these ways that you might find yourself being persecuted? So the first one there, and these all appear on your page too. Your employer, supervisor, or fellow workers at times make things hard on you. Maybe even just in the way that they talk. They know that it irks you to hear obscenities, foul language, off-color jokes, and so they make sure that you're within their hearing. Or maybe even scheduling. You'd really like to have off on a weekend. Your boss knows that, and so he's not real cooperative, or she's not real cooperative in scheduling that way. Or another way. You're being pressured into another Christian denomination or non-Christian religion. Not sure if that's really that common, although when you start dating, or sometimes if you would marry or have family members that maybe marry into your family, if they're quite pro whatever beliefs they are that might be against the Christian faith. They might actually go on a campaign in order to speak out or work against your trying to keep the family as Christians, maybe even yourself. I've known cases where that's happened. C, people close to you speaking out, even acting out against beliefs important to you. That might be the case where, I don't know, especially a younger generation maybe is questioning some of those things that they learned growing up that you tried to instill in them, and now they're not so sure. In fact, they kind of make it a point to be challenging. D, things that have to be attended to that interfere with church Bible study or prayer. Everything that's going on, and sometimes life becomes just so crazy that can you really keep up that routine that you're used to having? E, your own sinful nature, and at times the devil making you lazy or leading you into sin. That maybe you're not as watchful about the gossip or about the complaining or about just the worry or the fear that you think, well, that's just the way I am, or that's the way things are right now, where God says, no, you're really not like that. You shouldn't be like that. Or maybe something else. Are any of those especially difficult for you? And if so, would you want to share an example? I'd say D and E probably especially for me. Even I think sometimes talking with some of the young people these days, C has really been something that you almost are on the defensive, even as a pastor, like you don't know what you're talking about because of the way they know things to be. Yeah.
When I was working for the government, we weren't allowed to talk about religion at all on the premises. If you talked about church or whatever, unless the other folks you were with in the break room, felt comfortable talking, but most of the time we couldn't.
Yeah, so how far do you press that, right? When you're told at work that there shouldn't be any religious discussions. I know a school teacher who was under the same obligation that, he wouldn't bring beliefs into the classroom. Although he was allowed to share what he believed if people asked him. So if a student would ask, he'd even sometimes keep a Bible on his desk. And, parents or kids would walk in and they say, oh, you got a Bible there? Are you a Christian? And he would often be able to give some encouragement. But, Big Brother or the principal might have been watching it at times. And he would have had to possibly face, the repercussions from that. And, So sometimes, how far do you go? How much do you still need to do in order to remain faithful? And there's many ways that we can be pressed not to be faithful in the way that God says that we want to be and even need to be in order to continue as Christians. So as we get into the first part of Daniel, agree or disagree, it was more than greed and jealousy in the government leaders that drove them to be opposed to Daniel. So let's take a look at that first section and see where that opposition is coming from. Chapter 6, verse 1, it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom and 3 administrators over them. One of them was Daniel. The satraps were accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Maybe compare those satraps to governors. Quite a large empire, even much larger than the Babylonian one, so divided into these 120 states, so to speak. And so these satraps or governors put in charge of them, but unlike in our country, the governors then had to answer to the cabinet members, these three cabinet members, administrators, of which Daniel was one. And then, of course, above him was the ruler, Darius. Now, Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So kind of like Joseph down in Egypt. He so distinguishes himself that I can leave things completely up to him. Honest, bright, intelligent, wise, authoritative, a great leader. He'll take care of everything underneath him. All of these provinces, these states. At this, verse 4, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. Squeaky clean. They couldn't come up with a charge, any problems with his administering. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So here's his weakness, his Achilles heel, his faithfulness, his commitment to his Lord. Before we get to that question that I'd asked before, just to kind of give you the time frame again, Daniel has been around a long time, since 605 when Nebuchadnezzar had first of all attacked Jerusalem, hadn't destroyed it that time like the second time, but Daniel in that first attack was moved out with a lot of the other leaders to Babylon. And then of course he ruled for the next 60 years under Belshazzar. Last time we heard of Belshazzar taking those articles from the temple and being under God's judgment, being deposed, actually put to death, and having the Medes and the Persians take over in their place. Daniel apparently wasn't around too much longer than that. Daniel's probably in his 80s or even 90s by this time. But after Belshazzar, interestingly enough, again, you'd have to say by God's influence and direction, he's able to have the same powerful position, even greater, in this next empire that comes along, even though I suppose most of the Babylonians and those fellow administrators with him, those magi, would have probably been put out of power, if not put to death. Daniel escapes all that. As far as the empire that he was in, you hear more about Cyrus, really, in world history than you do about Darius. Cyrus was really the Persian ruler that had consolidated his power and was able to conquer these other areas. If you start down there in that lighter colored area of Persia, that's where Cyrus makes his start, and then he, in a sense, kind of conquers, but also gains as allies the Medes, and then moving west from there, he conquers Lydia, and then in about 539, that's where he takes over that area in the middle there, what is called Neo or New Babylonia, where, of course, Daniel had been ruling. And so Daniel is made a part of that huge, huge empire, even which ends up including Egypt. Why is Darius mentioned then as the king? Darius, probably Darius the Mede, was the person who was the administrator, I suppose you could say kind of like a co-regent along with Cyrus. Cyrus was this conquering king who even down into the 520s was down in Egypt. So he wasn't really taking care of the rule, the administering, the collection of taxes, the making sure that people stayed under their control. So that's kind of what Darius was doing. And I guess in a central part, or maybe Darius wasn't even there in Babylon, but he left things in charge there for for Daniel, Daniel was under this co-regent Darius even while Cyrus was ruling elsewhere. Some people think that Cyrus and Darius were the same person, and there are some reasons to believe that, but it's probably more likely that Darius was this co-regent. So, back to that question. It was more than greed and jealousy in those government leaders that drove them to be opposed to Daniel. Obviously, it would have rubbed them the wrong way to have this non-Mede, this non-Persian, a Jew, a person from this conquered peoples to be in charge. Yeah.
They were afraid of Daniel, his God, and the power that they knew his God had.
Very likely, yeah. One of the things you find out about Cyrus is Cyrus said that God was allowing him to do this conquering so that the Jews could be sent back to re-inhabit the Palestine, the Promised Land, as God actually had prophesied. Even, in fact, Cyrus was called attention to way back 200 years before this as the person who would be doing all this 2 empires before Persia even came along. So, yeah, the influence that Daniel and his God had, what is that going to mean for us? In fact, what's happening, right? Daniel's getting put above all of us, and what is that going to mean for us and our power, or even what he and the Jews are going to do to us? One of the things that we know from Persian history, if you go down to, go back a slide or two, if you see Queen Esther there, again, about 100 years after this time with King Xerxes, at Queen Esther's time, remember there was that evil man in his cabinet, Xerxes' cabinet, that tried to pretty much exterminate the Jews, declared or brought about this law that declared open season on them. And so the Jews were not popular people. They were despised, feared, seen as enemies by many of the people out here. Certainly racism was strong back at this time as well. So those would have been some of the things. And then possibly even just to have this one God over all the other gods, especially this conqueror God, that would not have sat well with these people who were trying to honor their gods above Daniel's. We'll go on then, verses 6 and 7. You might look at the question that goes along with that, number 5. Note the duplicity and devilishness in the leaders. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king. So quite a group. Maybe not all of them, but those 2 cabinet members opposite or alongside Daniel, and then possibly dozens, even 100 of these satraps group, and said, "May King Darius live forever, the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors." So everybody's on board. They have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce a decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. All agreed? Daniel wasn't in on that. Obviously, there were some lies there. Who knows? Maybe they were telling lies about all the other people, too. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. Daniel, of course, was very well respected and liked by Darius, in addition to Cyrus. And so how are you going to be able to remove him? You get a law that, as the Medes and the Persians had in their ordinances, if it was done by the king and given with the official authority and approval of his, it could never be repealed, even if it was an awful law. And that's what they got King Darius to do, knowing full well that this was going to put Daniel in opposition to it, and really the whole time plotting against Daniel to be thrown to the lions there. So in a sense, maybe a perfect storm with the lies, getting the king on their side. I suppose there was probably some nationalism that went into this, or at least some loyalty that they were looking for. Boy, if they worshiped the king as a god, which wasn't an uncommon thing back in those days, at least for 30 days, then you're going to have everybody on board, you're going to have everybody unified, then things are going to go smoothly. So it seemed like a good thing, even though it wasn't maybe something that Darius would have necessarily thought of by himself. Yep, I'll go along with this. The question on the page says, describe a perfect storm of evil that Christians can face or have faced. A perfect storm of evil that Christians can face or have faced, especially in their opposition to remain faithful. I can think of a lady who, her husband lost his job. He had some mental illness because of that, so he couldn't be relied on for a lot of the things, even just taking care of the kids. And so she was also taking care of him, and then having to find a job and having all of these things going on. And she became kind of challenging, questioning why would God allow all of this to happen to her, because she had been a faithful Christian. In fact, even though her husband hadn't been a part of the church, she had always gotten herself and the kids there. But after he lost his job and had that illness, and then everything was kind of falling upon her, she just kind of gave up. So there were all of these evils that were happening to her, and it's just everything came at her at once, and she was not able to continue to be faithful in the way that she had been. Can you think of any examples like that? Yeah.
I think teenagers face that challenge, young people face that challenge without Christian family support or a central family the way most of us grew up. And then they're surrounded by friends and peer pressure that has nothing to do with Christian lifestyle and choices. And it feels impossible to them to remain a faithful Christian when everyone around them either doesn't care or pushes them to do the opposite.
Yes, so for those of you online who maybe couldn't hear all that, a person that maybe grows up in a Christian household in a church but then finds themselves challenged as they get out on their own with all the influences that are not Christian. Maybe they're not necessarily directly leading them into a sinful lifestyle or away from their church attendance or belief in the Bible, but there's enough things that are going on that sooner or later some of those things that they believe to be true, or some of the things that they tried to stay free from as far as sinful, they find themselves letting their guard down. You think about it. What is it? I think the statistics are still pretty true. 2 out of every 3 of our confirmands are not going to be around during or after their college years in the church. And hopefully they come back, are brought back, but many of them are not. I mean, you can take a look at the pictures out here on the wall, and people can go down, like I think we all can in our confirmation classes, and say, boy, all of those classmates are no longer members of the church. Next section, verse 10. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. Set up, obviously. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So he didn't realize, what they were getting at, but of course they had set Daniel up. In fact, they know his usual routine. In fact, he probably had not been shy about that. King Darius says later on, I know how you continuously follow your God. And so these religious routines, rituals that Daniel followed, this was something that continued to go on, and they knew so, and so this was their chance to get rid of him. Point number 6, agree or disagree. Daniel didn't have to oppose the edict in the way that he did. He might have cut back or been less obvious in praying to God. So, did he have to pray 3 times a day? There was nothing in the Jewish law that said that. It may have gone along with some of the sacrifices that were offered during in the morning, midday, and then in the evening, or some of the prayer times that would have been carried on there at the temple worship that Daniel, of course, would have known from his earlier life. That seems like maybe a routine that he had been in, or at least known that his religious leaders tried to carry out. Could he have been less obvious? Did he have to face Jerusalem and bow down and pray to his God? Couldn't he have just said a prayer while he ate his dinner, and they wouldn't have been able to find him like this? What do you think? Daniel didn't have to oppose the edict in a way that he did. Agree or disagree? Yeah.
I don't think he had to do it that way, but I'm going to ask you, where does conscience come in here?
Mm-hmm.
It was against his conscience. He himself could
Yeah.
not bring himself to do that.
Yeah.
So he had to pray publicly.
So Al raised the question about conscience. Of course, conscience leads you to find something right or wrong sometimes that God hasn't said is, this is the way it is. But if it's something that would be godly, like this would be, then we're told to follow our conscience, especially if it's giving clear guidance in remaining faithful to God in a certain way. And Daniel in his conscience might have even said, boy, if this decree is such that I not pray to any other person than my God, or than to the king, and if this is what I've been doing, to cave into that, to do it a different way, would not be right. In fact, would not maybe be representing myself before God in the way that I need to represent myself. Any other ways of handling that? Daniel didn't have to oppose the edict in the way that he did. So that would be a disagree. In his conscience, he was left no choice. Maybe gets us into other questions like this. If Daniel hadn't continued with his usual practice of praying to God regularly, there may have been serious consequences for him or for God's people. Can you think of any? If he hadn't continued in that regular practice, or if others who were looking up to him, even depending on him to set the right example. If he hadn't continued to pray to God as boldly and as an honoring a way of God, would he have been less honoring of God? Would he have not maybe followed those prayer times, or maybe even including word that he was used to having? I mean, how did he get to be the person that he did? God was blessing him by coming to him through his word and by him continuing to go to the Lord in prayer. Or what about all those other Jews? Yeah, if Daniel's taking off for 30 days, maybe, we can take off for 30 days too. Not a big deal, especially if it's going to cost us dearly. God's going to understand. No. So there could have been serious consequences for God's people in continuing to remain faithful and really true to the true God, rather than letting something else get in his way or in their way of following him. Next point. What routines are important for us, and often for many who are influenced by us to continue following God faithfully? And then possibly, what difficulties do we face in following through? Maybe an obvious question. I'm not looking for anything that's really... What are some... Yeah, go ahead.
Attending church during COVID, and yeah, you can watch it online, but is that just to be too complacent, or yeah, I can get up and go in my pajamas, or
Yeah.
I'm not judging people who are doing that.
Yeah.
They have their reasons, but it's even attending Bible study. I know, like with women's Bible study, I set aside Monday night, and people will say, well, let's do this Monday night. No, I can't do that Monday night. You got to stick with why you're doing what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when other things come up, like even threats to our health, obviously we've got to take that into account, especially when we're more vulnerable. But is that going to interrupt our routine? And can we just say, well, maybe we're not going to follow it as regularly or as closely as we might in the way that we used to? I think that's probably been a real struggle for many of us here, or the people who haven't been coming here, of continuing to hear and listen and to be in worship and in the Word to the degree that we used to be, or maybe even should be, that we weren't to begin with. Yeah. Other ways that you would respond to that? We had in our 1 Thessalonians reading today, pray continuously. Is that something we're real good at? And I know I need to pray more often, and not to pray like, oh my, but actually, God take care of this and help me to have the patience and the trust that you are. The difficulty there is maybe the immediate catastrophe or complications that you're facing, or even sometimes the emergencies that we're going through. When God gave us the first commandment, you shall have no other gods, and then when he gave us the third commandment to keep the Sabbath, really putting it into our time, keeping those Sabbath times sacred, not to be interfered with from anything or anyone. He was saying that really not just for his own honor, but also for our good and for our benefit, so that by his law, his holy law, we could be kept in his path and kept from going off of that path and away from him. And not to remain faithful in those ways. So let something else become the God and start calling the shots, so that we don't have those Sabbath times, whatever they might be, whether it's worship or being in the Word. And again, you think of how regularly are we studying and learning God's Word. And if we're not able to do that on our own, if we just kind of throw up our hands and say, I just don't understand this. Well, get somebody else to be with you who does, or enroll in a Bible study with the pastor. And in a sense, it's so easy these days, but there's so many things that can also get in the way. And those things really can't get in the way, even if we don't face the same kind of opposition that Daniel did. I think of just the incredible faithfulness on the other side of that that our members here at St. Matthew have shown. We're giving out more meditations than ever. We're still sending out 80 sermons. And we've taken some people on the list, but we've added that as we've called through the membership, and they said, oh, yeah, I'll take some of those. Or even some of the prospects who said, well, it just doesn't work for me to follow online. And maybe some of us who are older can understand that. Give me something in print. Or even some of the people that you see signing in on Facebook every week, or for some of the Bible studies that come up, like some of you people online right now. That faithfulness in that routine that God has given to you is really keeping you close to Him and keeping you a follower of His, in spite of the opposition, the difficulties in doing that. Next section, verse 13. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty. So really painting him out to be a bad person, of course, which wasn't true. Or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the judge gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. Next point brings up number 9. Note some of the remarkable events described here. First of all, King Darius' reaction to Daniel's opposition. It wasn't like King Nebuchadnezzar when the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to bow down to his idol. He wasn't enraged. He was distressed. He did everything that he could to try to work around the law that you couldn't work around in order to save Daniel. Daniel's reaction, we're not really told yet. Although from what he says at the end, and maybe he wasn't so calm and collected at this point, but you kind of guess that he was. Just like the 3 men in the fiery furnace had said before they were thrown in, God may save us or He may not save us, but we are going to be faithful to Him. We are not going to give His honor away in idolatry. And even Daniel's being placed into the lion's den. You go back there, if you know the end of the story, when the others are thrown in, they don't even make it to the floor without the lions ripping them apart. But as Daniel is put in verse 16, then King said to Daniel, maybe that happened as he was being thrown in. It almost leads you to think, though, that this is what he was calling down to Daniel. The lions don't seem to be doing anything to him. In fact, they placed a stone over the mouth of the den, so it seemed like it was some kind of enclosed chamber, and you were kind of let down from above. And then the stone was put there and sealed so that nobody could disturb it, so that somebody couldn't be sent by the king to rescue Daniel before the night was over. All of this was happening, and there doesn't seem to be anything that's happening to Daniel this whole time, even while he's facing those lions down there. So right from the start, there seems to be some remarkable evidence that Daniel is going to be rescued from this. Point number 10, God's command and promise in Psalm 50, verse 15. Do you remember it? Maybe you don't remember those references, but you probably remember the passage, call upon me in the day of trouble. You, Lord, will deliver me, and I will honor you. I've got that here on the next slide. The question on your page is, do you remember it? And do you do it? That whenever you're facing some trial, some difficulty, some suffering, maybe even something that would keep you from church, or from being in the Bible, or from praying. I'm just too tired, or this is just too much, and what good is it going to do? Do you still do it? Call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you. Do you hold God to his promise? You're going to deliver me. Not necessarily to solve the problem at hand. Maybe your health's not going to get better. Maybe the situation that you're in at work, the opposition, the difficulties that you have in remaining true to some of the pressures that you're facing as a Christian. Maybe those aren't going to go away. Maybe they're going to get more difficult. But do you hold God to his promise that you're still going to deliver me from falling into those sins, from renouncing my following you, or looking up to you, or being faithful to you? Do you look forward to the end of being opposed and all that could be lost from the very beginning? What I mean by that is, and you will honor me. In the end, you are going to praise me for the deliverance that I give to you in remaining faithful in spite of the opposition. And do you see that even at the beginning? Because God has promised that, and God says, you call on me, this is the way it's going to happen. A good reminder, I guess, first commandment, third commandment, second commandment, right? At least Martin Luther's explanation to it, some of the added meaning there. Do not misuse the name of the Lord your God, but what? Call upon it in every trouble, pray, praise, and give thanks. Something that should be a continual routine in our lives, and in remaining faithful to God. To pray without ceasing, like the Bible passage says. Note how looking to Jerusalem guarantees God's promise. How could Daniel be sure that God was going to deliver him? That this evil was going to be too much? Maybe he would have caved in some way when he got out there and saw the lions ready to pounce on him, to tear him to pieces. Looking to Jerusalem. That's the place where the sacrifices had been made. Those sacrifices that removed anything that would have stood between God and his rescue. The sin, the evil. It went to Jesus. And, of course, Daniel probably didn't know all that, but we do. And so looking to the sacrifice that Jesus offered, it really guarantees us that Christ is there. He's hearing and operating against, and helping to bring us through, to help us, to give us the strength to remain faithful. Next section. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They were not hurt, or they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Question here is, what are 2 or even 3 reasons given in this section for God sending his angel to rescue Daniel? There's actually some reasons that Daniel gives why that angel was sent to protect him in the powerful way that he did. Can we find those in that section, in Daniel's answer? Yeah.
He was found innocent in God's sight.
Yeah, so he had not done anything wrong before God. Anything else? Yeah.
He was a faithful servant of the king.
Yeah. So he wasn't guilty of any corruption, even though there was this law that was made up against him. And At the end there, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. So those are some of the reasons he said, or that are shared there, really in Daniel's writing, by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, that he was rescued. Well, it kind of reminds you of the Secret Service protection that we have as Christians by even the angels that God sends. God himself, of course, looks after us, is present with us at all times, is protecting us. But if that wasn't enough, you also have these angels, or even an angel who is powerful enough to keep all of these lions under control so that they didn't come near Daniel, didn't cause him any harm. That's something that we as believers are guaranteed, which an unbeliever would not be guaranteed. God certainly is there and may rescue them, but doesn't dispatch his angels in the special ways to give the special protection to them that he gives to us. That kind of that goes along with some of the reasons that Daniel was rescued. There's that follow-up to that. Why would sharing these reasons for rescue be encouraging, especially for a Christian who hasn't always been so faithful? So I haven't been honoring God in my life. In fact, you look at my life, I think people who see me as a Christian would probably not think too much of my God, or especially, or even my faith in him. Or maybe a Christian will say, I certainly haven't been the kind of Christian I should be, attending church, praying, keeping other things from becoming more important to me than God. I failed in a lot of those ways. So how can I be sure that God would continue to rescue me? How could Daniel say that he was innocent before God? You think he had his fears? You think he had his temptations? Maybe I don't continue to pray 3 times a day to go against his conscience. I'm sure he did. He was a sinner. Yet he was called innocent. How could he be called innocent? He was forgiven. That's what Christians need to hear. If we are going to remain faithful, we have to be told we're innocent. Those things that have been keeping us from being faithful, all of those sins, we're really freed from those. It's something that God isn't going to hold against us, and they're not evil, sinfulness that is going to hold us back from following God. Because that's the lie, right? The lie is that I'm just not the kind of Christian that a lot of other Christians are. I'm going to be this lesser Christian. Really, there is no such thing, right? We as Christians are completely loyal and faithful and do everything we can to follow God in the ways that he says. And there's nothing else for us. Often we fall short of that, and yet God continues to renew that innocence in us so that we can be that way. And so why not make a start now, right? Because you've got a fresh start again today, just like you did yesterday or the day before, like Daniel did as he continued to look towards Jerusalem and be reminded of those daily sacrifices that were offered for his sins. Sometimes a person says, I don't know if I really trust God enough. Maybe that's why he's not rescuing me. What would you say to a person like that? Maybe you should trust more. Maybe you should pray more. You should. How are we able to trust? Only by having someone and the evidences that show us that God is as trustworthy as he says. That even in the greatest evils, can't see them, but they're there, those angels that are protecting us. And going back to a story like Daniel, or showing all the ways that Jesus was there for his disciples, even when they couldn't figure out what was going on as he went out to be arrested, or thought that they had to rescue him. And really, he was rescuing them, right? Just showing all the ways that he continues to rescue us and why he is so trustworthy. That's what leads us to trust, not our looking for evidences where somehow in our life we can see that, and so now we're going to trust God because he rescued us in the way that he wanted us to. What would have happened if Daniel had been eaten by those lions? I don't think he would have been any less trusting, because as a Christian, he could have been trusting God, that he was rescuing him from the evil situation that he was in, finally the evil world that he continued to live in, to be free from all of that in heaven. So some great things that we learned from that. I think I'm going to cut off our study there and just remind you that, again, what you see happening here at the end of Daniel chapter 6, which is actually carried out in some of those prophecies too, where it looks forward even to the end of time, to even the dead rising, both those who are believers and unbelievers on the last day. And again, underscoring the fact that was being put forward again and again in what was happening to Daniel and his fellow Jews, that in spite of all the things that were working against them and even taking them away from the place where it is that they wanted to be and to be God's people and even to remain in faith, that in spite of all of those evils that were working against them, God continued to overcome all of those evils and actually ruled over them even as these powers were working against them and God's people. So God really overcoming or conquering all of those powers for his kingdom, for people to remain faithful to him, and for people like Daniel to remain faithful even in the spite of or in the face of losing one's life. We can expect the same, that whether it's our physical life or maybe giving up more and more of the life that we so much value and hold dear, and even sometimes in a way kind of expect God to give to us, that's okay. As much as that life might be taken away, or the people around us that we're looking to strengthen or support us, even in our Christian values, God is going to be there in order to conquer the evil so that we can remain faithful to him, to be a part of his kingdom, to worship him, to pray to him, to keep him as our God, and finally to be found innocent before him when we're taken to be with him. Let's pray. Lord, continue to be faithful to us so that we can be faithful to you. It's not an easy thing, even though we have been dedicated and committed to you. We can all find times in our lives when we haven't had that commitment. Maybe not openly, but in our hearts have been ready to give up or not to be as godly or as trusting as you say that we should be. Help us to look to Daniel and help us to really look to you, the God of Daniel and the rescuer of him, the one who gave him such faithfulness and then who did not disappoint, but gave him the resolve, gave him the innocence by your forgiveness, who gave him the trust as you continue to give to us, so that we can remain faithful to you. And as we do, bless us in that and also bring honor to you in the way that we honor you with our faithfulness and the way that others look up to you because of us. We thank and praise you for the opportunity, for the privilege and the power that you give to us as faithful followers of you. Amen. Have a good rest of the day.